Vamos a empezar la primera sesión del ciclo Argument del segundo cuatrimestre, que, como sabéis, trabaja bajo el lema general de Dual Practices. Tengo que daros las gracias a todos los que estáis aquí venciendo la contraprogramación del fútbol Madrid-Barça, ¿no? Que entendemos que es difícil. Queríamos también compartir con vosotros que ya hemos sacado el primer número de la colección Argument. Es decir, es el número que recoge todo el trabajo del ciclo que tuvo lugar el año pasado, tanto otoño como primavera, y que trabajó bajo el tema general de Sampling Context. La verdad es que creemos que es muy importante porque el proyecto de Argument no es solamente el ciclo de conferencias. O sea, desde el principio nació con la idea de que todo lo que íbamos a estar trabajando durante este año no eran eventos como de una sola tarde, sino que tenía que producir una reflexión y que de alguna manera esa reflexión tuviera una cierta trazabilidad. En el caso de Sampling Context, creo que además es especialmente importante haber conseguido reunir pues, todas las referencias de las que se hablaron en cada uno de los eventos, algunos de ellos dobles, con estas matrices de imágenes que fueron tan sugerentes y que muchas veces pues fue difícil, ¿no?, como captar absolutamente todos las citas, las referencias, y entonces de alguna manera todo eso se ha podido trabajar y condensar. Vais a encontrar también textos de cada uno de los comisarios. Quiero nombrarlos a todos sin olvidarme de ninguno, espero. Enrique Espinosa, muchos están aquí. Enrique Espinosa, Eva Gil, Carlos García, Begoña de Abajo, Borja Sagallago, Álvaro Martín Fidalgo y, por Dios, Ángela Ferranz. ¿Y me olvido de alguno que no haya venido? No. Luego tenéis también, bueno, está aquí. Vais a tener también textos inéditos de gente que se ha invitado, como Jesús Basalo, otros que se han traducido por primera vez al español, como una entrevista con Enrique Walker. Yo no sé si alguno de vosotros tenéis como ganas de tomar la palabra y decir un poco qué es esto, porque, ¿no? Venga, Begoña, ¿no? Di algo tú. Venga, Carlos. Bueno, y luego ya le pasamos la palabra, ya me callo y les pasamos la palabra a los...
Bueno, en esta encerrona de 7 me ha tocado a mí. Bueno, nada, simplemente que ha sido un trabajo, y comentábamos esta semana, decía Enrique, que cuando comenzó pensábamos que iba a ser algo divertido, que no sería muy complicado, que no nos iba a llevar mucho tiempo. Total, somos 7, no nos vamos a repartir bien el trabajo. Y todo eso ha sido verdad, pero ha sido mucho más intenso, mucho más costoso y mucho más trabajoso. Sobre todo nos hemos dedicado mucho tiempo a que esto esté hoy aquí. Agradecemos a Silvia, Andrés, al departamento por la oportunidad de haber podido hacer este libro, que creemos que está súper bien y que os animamos a leer, a ojear y sobre todo a mirar con detenimiento toda la carga gráfica que tiene, que es mucha, porque en el fondo es de lo que queríamos hablar, de todo ese imaginario que los arquitectos incorporan a sus prácticas de forma activa y operativa para hacer sus arquitecturas.
Bueno, buenas tardes. Yo voy a hacer un primer resumen recordando de qué se trata el ciclo que iniciamos en el primer semestre. Nuestro ciclo se titula Dual Practices. Los comisarios son Fernando Rodríguez, Pablo Oriol, que está entrando por esta puerta, Juan, Elvira y yo mismo, Fernando, Pino. Y nuestra propuesta, en realidad, partió de la base de poder mostrar esa condición dual que nos parece como muy característica de esta escuela, pero también de muchas otras, que es la práctica profesional y, por otro lado, la condición académica como una propuesta como muy potente y muy ligada a condiciones casi como especulativas y de mucha intensidad, ¿no? Y cómo ambos campos realmente pueden mezclarse y qué es lo que están haciendo en otras escuelas en Europa similar a este tema que nosotros consideramos que es muy local y muy perteneciente a la escuela, pero que realmente hay otros lugares donde se está haciendo. En el primer cuatrimestre tuvimos con nosotros a Piet Ecker, a Luis Callejas y a Humberto Napolitano, y en este segundo semestre empezamos esta segunda parte, este ciclo, con Markus Bader de Raumlabor, Berlín. Now I'm going to change to English to explain the background, not the CV, because it's a really long CV, explain your work. But well, they are an office of a lot of members. He's one of the first members, the co-founders of the company, of the office. They are working since 1999, and now they are 9 members in the office, and they are working in a very complex or in a huge or big range of different possibilities of architecture. One of them is related with the urban situations, art, possibilities of the city in transformation, and the engagement of the people as part of the elements that are involved in their work. Now we are going to see deeply with your presentation these things and your work in the UDK University in Berlin. So please let's give Markus a warm welcome, and it's your time. Thank you.
I think it's, thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks to everybody who is here now to listen to this, to me talk about something that in the series of Dual Practice. I really, really like the title, I must say. It's been a topic that somehow I've been exploring, we in Raumlabor have been exploring to quite some extent, this question of what is the architectural practice, where is it going to, and how can we as educators and as practitioners somehow also create new conversations around that and sort of new practices of education and making architecture. And yes. Also a very warm welcome to the very youngest that are here. I'm very happy that we have such a broad audience that is interested in architecture and is already at this young age picking up ideas on how to proceed. That's amazing. Earlier in your lecture series, I think you heard that our friend from Zurich, he was talking about architecture as back then being a homogeneously taught discipline towards something like harmony, and that now we live in a time where this harmony paradigm somehow doesn't help us anymore so much. I would say yes, I can sympathize with that as an approach to architecture. I would say it very much resonates with what we discuss in Raumlabor as public space and the city in general being a place for difference and being a place where you encounter the other and the other as being different, and where it's much more about let's say also a spatial practice, but also a social practice of somehow getting along with each other and producing space, producing a city with each other, rather than trying to sort of work towards dominant ideas and erase other ideas. Yep. So what you see here is, maybe, and is an attempt to say maybe I'm not the right one to be invited to the lecture series, because yes, there is University of the Arts in Berlin. Basically, my engagement in an institution, educational institution, and on the other side is Raumlabor Berlin as a practice. And in between are these sort of hybrid forms. And I think I've been very much invested and interested in this kind of hybrid forms of education that are called Urban School Ruhr to the left. Up there, this nice logo is Open Raumlabor University. And down there is the Floating University as a Raumlabor project that happened last year. And Open Raumlabor University is really the idea that maybe, as we're still not producing architecture in a traditional sense in our studio, maybe we're producing something else, and we're probably definitely producing much more immaterial values than material values. No Raumlabor work has ever reached permanence or has been resold or entered any kind of market condition. So I think we really work on something else that is not traded. And at some point we thought, okay, maybe as a lot of learning happens in these projects, maybe we could also relabel ourselves from an office to a university. And that's how Open Raumlabor University came into the world, more not only as a claim of like, hey, we could also be an institution, but also in a way as a challenge to ourselves. Like in the conversation between the 9 of us, of course, many were like, hey, why are we a university? In what way? We're not. No, like we don't have university building, we don't have proper staff, we have no contracts, we cannot give out credits, so why, in what way? But I think it's, on the other hand, we've been invited a lot to refresh what Benny likes to call the sleeping universities and the sleeping students. When the university staff becomes really desperate with the sleeping students, some of them thought a Raumlabor workshop is a great idea as a sort of general wake-up call. And and if we are sort of invited into the institution, why not say like, or we somehow develop this fantasy, what if we connect all these little bits where it's more educational than actually productive, that what we do, and this would be a curriculum of an architecture course. And I think we're still exploring that notion. So I will try to take you a little bit into this scope of hybrid, fake, invented, narrational, institutional frames that have an educational side to them. To sort of characterize them, they are self-organized, as the Raumlabor is still a very sort of small-scale / half-informal organization. It's non-institutional, and it's a framework that offers workshops, excursions, so we do collective situations, living experiments, as learning formats. It is based on informal networks, nurturing of friendships, time-intensive encounters that are commons-based, peer-to-peer exchange. And it asks questions about how we might learn about the contemporary urban condition and the relation of the subject within it, the future imaginaries of spatial practice, how and what it means to become a practitioner, and the agency of such a practice. And I really like the term, or two terms I like to discuss a lot, is the term architecture through practice and architecture with or what is the agency of architecture, which is a term that it took me really long to kind of translate it into German and understand the concept behind it, because it's called, in German, it's called Handlungsmacht, which is a very difficult term, sort of the power of acting. But what we like in Raumlabor from the beginning is this idea of approaching a situation through an action or through activities, and this is this is embedded in both terms, in the term agency and in the term practice. And I think also the term practice asks the question: how do we do architecture? Instead of what is the result of our architectural doing. And I think this is super, for me that's super interesting. The first example that I will illustrate a little bit is called Urban School Ruhr. And it was somehow, if some of you know Raumlabor projects, they tend to be temporary, they tend to be, or we're known for temporary constructions that have a social, a cultural, a political, but definitely also a spatial level. These temporary constructions appear in a city space and then are then offered as a place for encounter. With Urban School, we said maybe we could do it the other way around. What if we do a place for discussing how to engage with the city before the actual intervention? So that's the conversation before the intervention. And Ruhr is a specific area in Germany called Ruhrgebiet, or the Ruhr Valley. It's the former super hardcore industrial core of the country. It is, if it would be one city, it would definitely be the biggest city in the country. And you can see in the red, many of these cities have somehow grown together. This is an image that somehow describes the contemporary condition as being very much post-industrial, in an in-between, between, you still have some kind of major industry, some technological histories, some technological presence, but the future is definitely not so much anymore in this kind of big technological infrastructures. This is where we like Cedric Price, also as a historic quote, saying that technology is the answer, but what was the question? And I think for us this was very descriptive in a way, as for the Ruhrgebiet maybe being an area that a little bit lost its narrative. It always, for a very long time the narrative was about mining coal, making steel, building big machines. And now the sort of the major narrative is the Ruhrgebiet will be turned into a cultural area, or cultural production, the creative industries should basically be the future of this region. But how do you turn an industrial region into a cultural region? How do how do the people, if we think about agency, if we think about practice, how do you get the people from this one vision into the other, and also the doing? So we started the school that didn't exist as a, this is artists from Berlin saying we are now a school, and we thought to be a school we need a stamp. So we started with the stamp. It all started with the stamp, and then the stamp was taken into something like a graphic work to communicate. Here you see the logos of Open Raumlabor University and Urban School Ruhr in this kind of industrial graphic gray setting meeting. This is the poster we produced to set out in the region and talk about the school is coming. We also talk about large ambitions. Here is the Buckminster Fuller Dymaxion Earth map with a pin where Urban School is happening. We thought as a non-existing school we need some kind of presence, and we chose obviously the internet. So we had to build up a website where you can see what the urban school agendas is, how you can become a participant in urban school, and what are the options, who are the people behind. Very important was, of course, also a calendar, so you can see what's going on when. And the first offers of these urban schools was research trips, as we thought that the people in the Ruhrgebiet are not the only ones that are living in areas of transition, that are somehow caught between these large narratives, but there is actually people in many cities that have similar experiences, that live in a similar condition, and that it would be fantastic if we could connect practitioners from the different cities with each other. And we do this through visits. We visit each other. And the first trips went to, all the trips went to Paris, Marseille, Athens, and Liverpool. Here you see some glimpses of us discussing in Paris, and we understand this as basically as a traveling class. So you could apply with an open call. You could, we would meet at some point in one of these cities. We would not know each other, and then over the course of 4 or 5 days, as you know it probably from your institutional research trips, a program unfolds and a discussion unfolds, and also something like a common discussion is formed within the group. Here is pictured are moments of that we call class time. We understood very fast that it's super important as it's an encounter of strangers, that we not only expose ourselves to, let's say, program that we pre-organize, that we meet practitioners that can share exciting examples, but that we also need time to reflect and time in the group to discuss how to understand these examples and how to make meaning out of them. So here you see the project by Atelier d'Architecture Autogérée, where we met some neighbors and inhabitants that showed us their project, and I think it's a super nice, to the left, super nice example, because you see something like an architecture, but it's not relayed to us by the architects themselves, so it's not an author story, but it's relayed to us by the users that are talking about their using experience. And this is architecture as both as a spatial and a social practice. And to the right, I think this is, you see Antoine from Bellastock showing some pictures in their research site where they're researching with pre-used materials. Up we're in the new development in Marseille. Down, I think we're in Athens. Up, we're in Athens, launching with DPR. You can see César to the left. The book by Aristide Antonas, On the Stairs of the Acropolis. And to the right, we're sort of engaging in some sports classes on top of the Unité d'Architecture by Corbusier in Marseille. Here we're in Liverpool, which has a very, very harsh condition of depopulation and demolition. It's a scheme that is called Housing Market Renewal Scheme, which is a very cynical way, I think, of calling an urban renewal plan. And it was really, basically the agenda is to get people out of their houses that are paid off, demolish the houses, build new houses, and make the same people buy a new house from a new developer. So they need to take a new mortgage, and something like a neighborhood reorganization happens. And what we visited is this little house. It's a bakery on the corner where the artist Jan van Heeswijk, as part of the Liverpool Biennial, started to talk to people in the neighborhood about how they could organize their resistance and their protest against this scheme. And they, in a sort of process, started to reuse or reopen the bakery, acquire the building, and started as a social project, but also as a small company, and mostly really as a place to get together, to feel together, and to feel also their agency in getting things done, and not only feeling individualized, separated, and powerless against the larger schemes. So here, I mean, what do we do? A lot in schools like this, we cook, actually. So for us, not only discussing, no, but also cooking is important. And I think that's one thing that we learned from urban school, where we enter, and we call it basically everything is of equal importance. I think that would be probably a soft translation. Because we realized that if you run a program like this and you want to have an interesting discussion with people you don't know a few days ago, it's as important that you have had something like a good lunch and you can live, as you have an interesting input, as you have an interesting discussion together. And I think, and a good place to sleep and so on. So really to understand the school not as something that separates the body and the mind, or that separates the learning and all the other activities, but to understand the school that is really a place where you sort of literally move in and you spend your time with all your desires and needs. I think that was a school that we were interested in. What you see here is the shop in Ruhrgebiet, because after this travel phase, the first phase, we located the school in a small town called Witten, and here you see us in this shop. Witten has this condition of, like in these post-industrial cities, there's less people living there. There's a sort of high unemployment, and the former main streets that used to be full of shopping are not only tackled by internet shopping and poverty, but also tackled by shopping malls nearby. So there's a lot of pressure on a space that was formerly a space that was probably perceived as a common space, as the place to go and meet the other and see how city life, experience something like city life. And we were happy to get into one of them and place the school in that sense also, or give the school also a visibility and an accessibility to a certain extent, that it's not happening in a faraway institution behind a very big door, but that it's happening where the people are really. We also curated a program similar to you curating a lecture series. And this is, and we communicated that in something like this timeline. And part of the school was also, you could call it, in conferences, we would probably call it a breakout session, was the mobile classroom, where the building of the classroom was part of the class. And here we go on top of the parking house, you probably say that, on top of a parking in Hattingen, the city next to Witten, setting up our mobile structure, to only then realize that it's actually quite hot up there. And you see the table is outside the bubble, in the shade of the bubble, because that's actually the much nicer place to work. And that's another format we invented for urban school. You see here an example of an artistic intervention by the artist Valentina Karga. It is, she calls it hot stuff, and it is a a bench in public space that it is heatable with fire. And it's in our, in our school narrative, we call it as if installation. You see the setup here. Before she did a participatory workshop with people to create tiles for this. And then the collectively built public space intervention is there and it works. You can see the fire and you can be happy and have a warm back and a comfortable seating experience. And then after a very short time, in this case it was 1 day, it's taken apart because as we know, public space, not only in Germany, is highly regulated and is very much driven by, regulations are of course driven by experiences of loss and risk, but I guess they're also, the as if installation tries to overcome this in a way, or address this. Because if you say like, yes, we're going to have a real fire with a hot bench in the public space, maybe that sounds really, really unfamiliar and strange. And it's probably hard to convince people in the city office that they should give a permit to this. But if it's already experienced, in this case, we could invite, the artist and us, we could invite everybody from the city office to local initiatives to see like, look, this is what a hot bench looks like and this is how it feels. And then take it away again. But through the experience, actually, a sort of process was started that here you see the artist with an interested neighbor group discussing with the support of Urbane Künste on a possible future site where this project could travel. So, in a way, Urban School started with travels, connecting, let's say, people with a condition of shrinkage and a city that is somehow very much in transition, with this sort of looking for a new narrative, to people with similar struggles in other cities through the travels. Try to use this as a sort of build up of a group, of a resonance group in Witten, that we could then work with in the local workshop situation when we were inhabiting the shop, and somehow ending with this as if installations, not as a sort of symbolic handover, like now everything is condensed in these objects, but more like, okay, after all these discussions, some interventions, some actions are actually possible. Many of the findings and discussions we pulled together, and they're now available in the book Explorations in Urban Practice, which is published with little advertising with DPR Barcelona, and is available, I think it's very easily available in Spain. In other countries it's a bit more difficult. Urban practice is a term I like to use a lot these days. I also like the term architecture or art or urban planning or urbanism, depending on where I am. But urban practice, somehow we're testing this as a term because we feel this practice that not only Raumlabor but many others are also doing, that is inhabiting these spaces in between, that is linking the sphere of the cultural production, the spatial production, that always has a sort of social dimension, and that also looks at a sort of political dimension of the work, that this is, to keep describing it as the in-between seems to be a little bit frustrating after 20 years that we now this year are happy to celebrate in Raumlabor. So we thought, maybe urban practice is something. You know? Maybe that exists. if we exist, maybe that exists as well. And I'm happy to discuss that, no? Because that in return, this asks the question then, okay, if do architecture schools need urban practice courses, or should architecture schools be turned into urban practice schools? Or is urban practice an independent master course that we're now offering after an architectural or social or other bachelor degree in our new university landscape? I would be happy to discuss that. I think that's an interesting question. And next example, the floating university. That's another wonderful hybrid, as it really took the university narrative that the Open Raumlabor University is first of all placing in a non-place. No? It's like it doesn't exist spatially. It placed it specifically in Berlin, and also in Berlin in a place that I would say is a dream place for anyone to be in, really. It's an absolute discovery of a potential in the city, and it was created as an offshore campus again for cities in transformation and practitioners around that. And offshore meaning it's a little bit off the city tracks, but it's definitely off the institutional frames, and it creates a condition that everybody is off their own territories. It invited more than 25 design and architecture universities that would come with their student groups to do workshops, conferences, and other programs. It had approximately 10,000 visitors, not only from an academic, but also mostly also from the general public. And it operated from May to September 2018. You could describe it as a laboratory for collective experimental learning, knowledge transfer, and the formation of transdisciplinary networks, challenging routines and habits of urban practices. And now here is the site. Can you imagine a university happening here? You can actually see it there, so the spoiler is already on the poster. But this was really the discovery. You see the radar tower of Tempelhof Airfield behind the trees. It is actually a piece of infrastructure that is generated by this former airfield in Tempelhof. And you see the red little thing with this kind of gray, funny shape under. That is the place for the floating university, and the infrastructural function and description of the place is it's a rainwater retention pool. So if you see all the kind of concrete areas and this huge building below, if there's heavy rain, as all of this is on the hill in Berlin, you cannot. The canal system would be not capable of dealing with that amount of water. So in the 1930s, when they constructed the airport, they immediately constructed this kind of buffer container, open-air water container, to keep the water and then slowly release it into the canal system. It's a nice place to be because in Tempelhof, after it was used as an airport since 2008, also has a history of let's say empowerment of the city of Berlin, as it's as far as I know the only place where around Berlin or in the country where through a public vote in a referendum, a development plan was stopped. The master plan looked at the sort of outer areas of the airport to be built, built on. And as after the financial crisis, there was a huge influx of capital into the market of Berlin, resulting in a radical change of the economic situation in housing, with exploding prices over the last 10 years, I would say. A very strong feeling in the city of we are being pushed out by economic means is present. And in Tempelhof 2014, I think it was used as or it was taken in a way as a showcase to express dissent with the political agenda and to publicly vote for the Tempelhof Gesetz, which basically says this is going to stay a public green area and is not going to be developed into real estate, as the people of Berlin had the feeling if it would be real estate, it wouldn't be for them. And that's, I think, an ongoing political discussion that is going on in Berlin very much. The question of to what extent the cities are a commodity that is traded and that is mainly produced for market forces, or to what extent the city is a place for people to live in. And if you want a mixed city with all sort of social levels of people living together, as I was describing in the beginning, with the difference, people from different backgrounds, with different ideas, different lifestyles, different economies. I think we need to find ways to organize that city. And we understand more and more that the market is not doing that. The market is working towards homogenizing living conditions by organizing them according to financial abilities. So this is sort of the neighbor of the floating university. And then in this kind of pond that we saw earlier, this was the architect's vision. Let's build this university. Here you see some pictures from construction. And I think when we talk about dual practices, here you see some students of UDK becoming part of this Raumlabor project. So it's actually a merger of the institutional and the informal, where the informal, I would say, offers capacities, offers ways of doing that the institutional, for the institutional was really, really hard to discover or to make. I would be sure with university it would be completely impossible because of all our bureaucratic procedures to make a project like Floating University happen. But as it's a Raumlabor project, Raumlabor can somehow be faster, be more flexible, be more, let's say, unusual in the way it acts. We can collaborate with our institutional learning background or learning environment and somehow insert our studio program into the Floating University. Here you see the water filter system. So Floating University, as I said earlier, has all this diversity of, let's say, design backgrounds, people coming. And of course, not only asking the question of urban development, but also asking the question, as we're all under the super large narrative of climate change, how do cities respond to that? And how can we, sitting in this polluted wastewater container, open air container, how can we find actions, activities that allow us into this narrative in a way? And I think this is, let's say, it's not only super important, but it's if you want to feel agency and if you want to create a momentum for people to feel like, okay, I can actually have an effect on these larger frameworks. I think we really, it's on us as spatial practitioners, as experts that navigate through scales to construct, let's say, situations that are inhabitable and that address some of these questions. They will probably not solve the problem, but as we live in the time of irrationality, where where everybody's ignoring the climate change is so much the major, let's say, narrative or the major situation, it is producing, let's say, a difficult contradiction in ourselves, that we see like, okay, the way we live is not sustainable, and the way we should be living, nobody does that. And how can we bridge that? Or how can we, let's say, work our way into this contradiction to not only sort of accept it and ignore it and try to forget it, but to somehow find ways of dealing with it, in a way. Yeah. What I think Floating University really offered, and here you see the auditorium, is a place of simultaneity and of coincidence. So while a public discussion is happening and the people on the table are basically what we're doing here, a sort of lecture setting, you see the sort of slimy pond in the background, and the family of ducks would come by and say quack, quack, quack. And I think this openness is a fantastic quality of the space. To a certain extent, an unpredictability. So this would be the same space, only a little after it was used by students from Phil Collins or was kind of transformed into a karaoke setting. Here you see students you see professional cooks in the UDK student-produced kitchen. Here you see the UDK students presenting with Aristide Antona some of their work in the same kitchen. Here you see the group, the workshop group with Studio Bazaar from Bucharest, inhabiting the bar as a classroom. And I think it's this kind of multifunctionality, the sort of multi-programming of the spaces, together with, as I said earlier, the coincidence of neighbors, gardeners, and academic people that created what I was called the multidimensionality of Floating University. So it's maybe not the better classroom as such, but I think it is potentially the better learning environment because it is not so cut off from many other elements of life. This is how the program basically worked. It was there is a series of open weeks that marked in gray over the period of the summer from May into September. And you see the blue lines, that is student groups that have a long engagement with the Floating University. And then up there in the sort of short blue lines, university appearances from different places. And I think this is quite unique that in UDK, the calendar would look like we have a semester, and then here we have an exhibition, and the university opens for 3 days for the public to come, and that's it. That's our moment of public encounter, where whoever is interested in what the university does is invited in. I'm very happy that our institution is still not locked, like we don't have security guards, we don't have key cards, we don't have any kind of advanced systems of access management. In that sense, it's still a very old school university. You can just walk into the building. And I had a feeling here it's quite similar. And I think that's a quality, It's like if this is a public asset, if this is a public investment into knowledge, into exchange, into working on ideas and on futures in a way, then it should be open and it should be, we should think about how it can be made even more accessible, probably. The open weeks in Floating University were quite heavy offer for the public. So that's much more going towards a wider audience than our university with a 2-day exhibition. Really offering stretches of 2 weeks with different artistic and scientific programs that you could just walk by and see people discussing something, or subscribe and become part of. And just some example how this looks. No? This is a workshop with Thor Lindstrand talking about playground spaces. This is a workshop with Tak exploring new aesthetics in architecture, I would say. Here is Jane Randall discussing the critical practice. Reading groups, the Tak workshop somehow getting spatial, beekeeping lessons, explorations into the landscape, and then also some evening gatherings. I think this is a photo of the closing party. So I think what Floating University makes is, you know, and I specifically started it not with this kind of infrastructure photo in the beginning, because I think what it really does is it offers all these small spaces, and it offers all this porosity for encounter with other ideas, or with other practitioners, or with other staff, or with ducks, or with rain. So basically with a variety of conditions that we can and need to react on to. And I'm very, I really love this infrastructure also, designed by our colleague Florian. But it, I don't know, somehow it is more than this piece of architecture as an object. Currently, we're working on something. We're taking the sort of the hybrid action one step further in the project that is called Making Futures. And Making Futures is a collaboration between UDK and Raumlabor, and it's happening in the context of the Bauhaus anniversary this year, because not only Raumlabor will be 20, but also Bauhaus. I think most of Germany is very excited that architectural Germany is excited that the Bauhaus is turning 100 years this year, and already now in February people are quite exhausted by the Bauhaus narrative being told and retold. Our interest was to use this as a frame to discuss the question of the architectural practice as introduced a little bit earlier in this collaborative effort. We are interested in, let's say, two perspectives in this context. One is the perspective of architecture as a collective form, and the other is the aspect of architecture as a resource. And as a resource, really meaning the material resource, the question of material possible reuse, what we call gray energy being stored in all the buildings. And the collective form, the question of how, as we were also touching upon in some of the urban school trips, how civic society can become, and all questions of the public good can become more supported in an architectural practice. I have a feeling, you know, back to this architecture as a harmonizing practice. This idea of architecture as a harmonizing practice comes from a time when there was a sharp divide between either a public commission or a private commission, either a commercial interest or a public interest somehow representing common interests or common goods. I think we're now at the time where in the discussion the question of the commons is becoming more and more apparent as we realize that the public sector has somehow let us down as communities, as commoners, in really acting towards what we call common good. The public sector, put under neoliberal economic pressure, often acted as a very much economic actor, selling off public goods and not really supporting the better life of the people, but maybe more focusing on supporting the better life of a market. And in that sense, I think it's a super interesting question. How can we as architectural experts rethink our practice to place it in that field? We operate in a similar way as we learned. We also do trips. We went to Istanbul and Palermo so far. We will be going into Thüringen very soon. We try to reach out to our audience with, again, a website that here collects statements from different people that we ask, slideshows, travel logs, etc. And also presents open calls as the major way of accessing what we do. And I think there it also differs from the institutional teaching environment. You don't apply, register, immatrikulieren, you immatriculate and then you get a number and then you subscribe to a course that takes either 3 years or 4 years or 5 years or 6 years. But you basically subscribe for a much shorter time, but a much more intense time. Here's some traces from our mobile workshop in Istanbul that was following the question of engaged education that was also asked by the Istanbul Biennial, that was titled School of Schools. And we were offering a sort of curated access to the biennial, selecting specific talks as well as here going on a critical, I would say, like a critical walk through the city, somehow connecting phenomena like the mosque under construction on Taksim Square with backstories to really understand how the urban fabric is being transformed with a political agenda, I would say, and how to potentially place an architectural discussion inside that. Here you see us having class time on the Bosporus, so it looks very picturesque, but it actually can be a place for extremely fruitful and meaningful discussion for a group like this. We did readings. The parasitic reading room was again a very fluctuous form of class, taking basically the form of the seminar, the reading of text, into the public sphere and making it present and visible. Here the reading room collaborated with a local little moving radio, so people would have the text on their headphones. The mobile workshop in Palermo, it was titled something like missing the word. Something like embracing uncertainty, not really, but the question of uncertainty and how to deal. How to plan, how to operate in uncertain conditions is something that is a recurring topic. And Palermo, I think, was a super interesting place to visit, as similar to Istanbul, it's placed in an in-between location seen from a Central European perspective, where Europe, or the condition of Europe, touches areas of the world with other conditions and other lifestyles and other political systems and other economies. And Palermo has this very direct way of talking about, the mayor talks about Palermo as a place for immigration, where the discussion about is led completely different than in Berlin, or in Germany, where immigration is problematized as the arrival of the other, and the question of how do we deal with all that. In Palermo, it was super interesting to discover that they also geographically and historically place a narrative of being a hybrid culture, where all these influences from Africa, from Europe, from different parts of Italy, always have been mixing, and that actually the European condition with putting a European outer border around Sicily creates a sort of end, kind of dead end condition for Palermo that was for centuries was never there. So now they're seen as the end of Europe, while actually you could also place Palermo in the middle of the Mediterranean as part of all these cultures that make up this geography. Here we see, and of course, as on all these trips, engaging with some of the local narratives is a way to get into the discussion. Here you see basically shredded houses from earlier speculation phases in Palermo that are where the city's beach was used as a dump, and all these little stones are actually former tiles and stones from buildings. So we're kind of looking for, we're looking for little treasures in buildings that were demolished something like 50 years ago to make place for speculation. That's a work by Roberto Colova that we saw here. The gentleman who gave us this tour as part of the Manifesta, a sort of wobbly bridge that also he sees metaphorically linking these different sides of the river, the question of where the city develops and how it sort of ignores former nice areas as now being not usable. To the left is the planetary garden by cooking sections, an idea to try to talk about climate change and how to produce local conditions around that. And Assessore Cosumano to the right is the sort of cultural minister of Palermo. He explained to us the sort of strategic level of the Manifesta, how he sees basically the culture as being part of a rebuilding of a city's narrative, and also sort of re-inhabiting in a way the possible city's futures. Here we are in Zendue, which is a pretty harsh social housing area designed by Gregotti, where the Manifesta project was like a neighborhood garden, and our fellow urban practitioners, I would say, from Coloco in Paris were invited to work there with a local initiative, Zendue Insieme, and we basically joined them in cleaning up the place in the beginning of the next workshop phase. But for me, this is a nice image, as it shows that a class is not only about understanding concepts of how does a city transformation work, but a class works very well also if you get your hands dirty and you become part of a situation, and by cleaning up this kind of stuff and not differentiating between the valuable work and the less valuable work and all that, you can, it's also a way of understanding physically. No? If we talk about situated knowledge, I think that's a term that resonates with me a lot. It makes sense to go where the knowledge is and to somehow experience how it feels there and to talk to the people that are there. And if we talk about embodied knowledge, I think it's also, and that for me has very much to do with action and activities, the physicality of us as learners, then it is also important what we actually do and how we do it. Here comes the next advertising block. Making Futures is not finished, but Making Futures will go on and is inviting you to come to Berlin to the Making Futures School. We will be running a 2-week, sort of similar to the Open Weeks of Floating University thing that could maybe be called a summer school, but maybe not. There will be practitioners that we invite and a lot of practitioners that apply. And we're looking at a sort of intense time together of around 40 to 60 people in Berlin discussing these questions of how can architecture be a collective form, or what is architecture as a resource. We are opening an open call on April 15th, and you will have time, and everybody has time to register, apply, send us an email until end of May. And the school is happening between 30th of August and September 15. It is placed in this amazing building, which is, it looks a bit shitty, but that's actually the case why it's so amazing. It's right in the center of Berlin. It's called Haus der Statistik. And it's in public ownership, so it was owned by the state and is now bought by the city. And it's empty since 2008. And since 2015, an initiative claimed its public and civic use. It really made a very, very fast career into a political process where there's now a team that is called Coop 5 between the city government, the district government, the housing company, and the city's real estate company, together with people from the initiative sitting around the table and planning the future collaboratively and consensus-oriented are working together on the future of this site. And I think that's quite for me, that's quite an amazing moment, let's say, in Berlin city development. This could become a model development of a new collaboration beyond the private and the public, where the civic society somehow takes form, and the civic society's space making is also somehow invented as a test, as a possibility in this project. So we will be, with our summer school, with the Making Future School, we will be situated right there in the middle of a building site, a project in transition, an opening of these spaces for first, we call it pioneer uses. And with pioneer uses, we mean that the meanwhile or temporary users, as we used to call them earlier, are actually also developers, space producers, and that we are discussing ways or looking for ways how these users can become, if they want to, also a part of the future of this site. So as you see, from a very architectural hardware point of view, there is a lot to do, and there is a lot to invent. We bring, in previous summer schools, we did, for example, this, Saale Onsen. So we bring a sort of repertoire that we want to explore there. Maybe we will be living in the building, use it as a camping site. Maybe it will be turned into a workshop where we explore also the different material and aesthetic questions. If I look at the time, I would say we're sort of, I don't know, we're sort of good. because of course there's always plenty more things to show, but maybe also not. I think, no, because I mean on the poster in this beautiful situation you also saw some office works, but I think the argument that I want to make is that with the office we try to work on hybrid situations that invite university out and the city in, and create really a sort of mixed situation between something like a wider public, between an architectural or professional audience, between young learners but also older learners. Our participants have been between, I don't know, 15 and 50 years old, more or less. So that's, and with this we really explore questions of how can we create learning spaces about city making as a sort of larger scale of architecture making in a broader sense. We also have more, let's say, object-oriented projects in Raumlabor that you're welcome to explore when our website is back up again, because we were hacked. And I'm also a little bit, but this should be happening soon, I hope. And so that would be the Raumlabor hybrid with university. And maybe one last thing I can show is, I prepared here, because we're in this sort of hybrid practice. Let's see how this works. Basically excerpts from University Live. This is, whenever we always run in our university, my interpretation of how to run the studio is to offer 2 design courses. One is run more like assignment-based, and that would be, here is the example of the assignment-based kitchen group project that was part of Floating University in their self-documentation. So we asked the students to make a documentary of all their works together at the end of the semester in the form of a little booklet. And this is the final hand-in, so it's not a product or a design or you know, like drawing of this design drawing of this kitchen, but in this case the production, the use, the improvement, the organizing around, as well as the reflection and the documentation of this action. That would be this design studio's work. And what I really appreciate is that they also organized a weekly cooking together and acted as hosts in the Floating University, inviting the other students that come from other universities around the table and into a discussion. Researching ways of acquiring throwaway food and make it available, and also work on the resource question a lot. But yeah, that would be this. And the other that is also that is presented also in this little shrine out there that you have. This we always call Do What You Want, and it's an interest-driven studio. And in the interest-driven studio, as it says, students are invited to come to do what they want. And they basically, as with their master thesis, where they have to come up with an own brief, come with their own design question or with their brief, with their methodology, with their own timeline. We coach them in designing that and understanding the asking of the posing of the question and developing of the question really as part of the studio work. And here in this brochure you just see the diversity of results. It's super interesting discussions, even though there's super different characters, super different ways of looking at architecture, super different scales, super different methodologies. We organize it, and this I'm very happy with, every week as a colloquium. So all students are there in the studio. There's always 2 who present, 2 to 3. And then everybody discusses, reflects on their work. So the studio is not only a place, you know, it's not the place where you sort of come for a presentation and you're super scared if you will be successful or not, or your hard critics will slaughter you, but that instead it is a space of solidarity and a place of mutual support, where you can feel that the intelligence is not only with the professors. They might say something clever every now and then as well, but that there is a lot of intelligence in the students, basically in everybody in the group, I would say. And that it's really about bringing this out and creating a dynamic and a sphere where architecture can be discussed in a very diverse way, and where you can show up with an amazing project or with a less amazing project, but everybody's respected and everybody's giving the time to get the feedback on their level, really. So that are the ways we operate in school, which is of course now very short in comparison to a very long time. I talked about the hybrid forms, and maybe that's because I really like, that's also a little bit my ambition. I think it's very frustrating the way we meet every week, and the conversation starts and stops in university, and I don't know, I'm really looking for ways of linking the discovery that we do in the informal projects more with the work that we do also in the formal institution. And I think with the Do What You Want and the engaged projects that are always part of, let's say, a real condition, we're very much on the way to experiment with that. This is our studio space, actually. That's an Erasmus student from Paris who was turning it into a camera obscura. As everybody was out in floating university, he could just use the whole space and turn it into his instrument, and he was very happy to be able to do that. And I think, for me, that's maybe a good example that the university should also not only be a place for transmitting knowledge in a pre-described form, but also a place for explorational work, a place for discovery, a place for experiment, and a place where things can go wrong. So that, because that's actually what learning probably also is about. Yes. And yeah, so there is no conclusion, but a blank page that we can fill together. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for this lecture, in which we saw a lot of different possibilities to see how is the way to teach and the way to learn. Completely different to the one that we have here. And maybe, if you are not so tired, we can open a short time of Q&A, question and answers. Yeah. Someone has something?
If you have this cooperation with the universities, do you have actively go to them and ask them, hey, we are Raumlabor, do you want to cooperate with us and do this project with us? Or I mean, in Germany you're pretty known, and the university probably will know what you're doing or what your plans are, but how would you describe it to a university just like the ETSAM, for example, in Spain or in other European countries? What is your aim with this project, and how do you start this cooperation with the universities?
I think this is referring to the floating university, no?
Yeah, more or less.
Well, while we are assuming sort of institutional forms, saying like we're a university, we're still a very small and precarious entity also. And I think this is important to have in mind. No? Like, there's no Raumlabor bureaucracy that we can say like, please make a research on all interesting university people worldwide and keep asking them and proposing what could happen. So it very much works through, basically through personal encounters. And I think everybody in Raumlabor is invested in a way. When we develop a project like this, we would of course ask around in our little pudding, who could we, who knows who and who could you propose it to? And that's a sort of organic network way of working that, which is not the best, I would say. I think it would be better if we could have a wider reach. But it's the one that we could probably still manage with this limited resources that we're working with. So in a way, the floating university now, as it happened, really it was sort of on a private, more or less, or based on on information channels that were built up over the last 20 years to say, hey, this is a possibility, and now I'm here and I can spread the word. And yeah, but we're hoping that floating university will be able to come back. Now it's down, but we're working on it as a possibility to have it as a sort of 3-year appearance, and then we could be a little bit more strategic in the way how to address and talk about it.
Hi, I'm interested in. Okay, you come here to speak. This is an academical institution. We think that maybe it's quite close in comparison with what the floating university represents, and also your professional studio, Raumlabor, as a context, as a working context that is quite experimental, represents. How can the university could approach more to the way the floating university works, or maybe is it the other way around? Can we make something like the floating university come inside a very close institutional university like this one in Madrid, and I guess most of them around the world?
I think that would be probably a discussion to have altogether, no? Like to what extent can this be an inspiration? I would say I didn't find a way how UDK could do it, a floating university, so no. I'm still looking for it. My colleague said, like, yeah, maybe you can do a sort of ein Reallabor, is a new German term for sort of locally embedded, engaged ways of mixing planning dynamics with the professional and then to a certain extent also academical level. So we're trying to explore tools that exist also in the funding and the research landscape that a real university could do that. So far we didn't find it, and all the Raumlabor projects are done under the label of art. So art gives us a lot of freedom to experiment, and then we need to do the work to sort of say, yeah, it's art, but it's also challenging universities and it's also challenging architects. So we're in between, I would say. For me, universities as I know them are much more a sort of fluidity of people in a fixed space. In floating university, we had a very fluid, sketchy space situation that could be rebuilt or added on. And I think this style, to bring this style more in the university protocol, I think we can work on. Like we can work on less computers, more cutting wood. We can work on let's make university projects that are happening in a collaboration with institutions or initiatives or situations in the city where we can also, as in our travels, have part of the class time there. We probably need to rebuild, like in Berlin, we would have to rebuild our curriculum in terms of how the weekly planning works. Because whenever I say, let's meet at the other end of town, where I get stressed students that say, we have to be back at 5 for engineering class, and they're making lists, and like I fail if. So I think that's the discussion.
Yeah. So I think we have to confront the fact that university has to change in order to be more hands on the materials, less less controlled, like paperwork, and also all these regulations and bureaucratic stuff that is happening in academic institutions. I don't know if we can find a mix.
Well, I think there is something that already exists in architecture's curriculum that I know. It's called Projektstudium. That's a German term, meaning that you don't separate all the sort of sub-disciplines, but you do in one design projects, you also do your urbanism, and you also do your structural engineering, and you also do your, your HVAC planning, in a way to understand the integratedness of the practice. And if we look at other schools like Central St. Martin's with their spatial practice course, I think they're trying to do a similar sort of integratedness, but probably less with engineering and more towards social and more towards participation and neighborhood questions. And I think, so I guess university has the protocols to a certain extent, but they would probably need to be a little bit rewritten and a little bit adapted, that they could engage with these topics.
Thank you.
I'm optimistic there, no?
Well, of course, when you confront your vision of education with a classical one, let's say, the difference is obvious. But I was thinking there are many procedures that are shared with institutional education that already are working. Let's say traveling, building workshops, and many things that have many points in common with what you showed us. So I was wondering what's really different, where it's relying. And it came to my mind. It can be whether in financial issues, where does the money come from? So that changes everything, even if the things that are happening are more or less the same, or it's the institution that, as architecture itself, the space that surrounds all these activities, that you feel you feel the institution when you're in a building like this, and you don't feel it when you're in the floating university. So these poles of power, money and architecture as a representative discipline of power, where do you think that the difference with classical education relies?
I think that's you pointed critical points, no? Like in ODK, I have a super limited budget as a department for spending. So I can basically buy paper. The budget is really built on an idea that I have a pen and a paper and I go into class and make corrections. We cannot really invite other practitioners. We cannot really collaborate in the sense of I can give a contract to somebody, So economy is definitely a question, because with the Raumlabor projects, they're always based on a sort of curatorial frame that we create, where we have the ability, of course, to use funding also to sort of go much further in building a situation. In university, I'm always depending on people's, let's say, willingness to invest free time. I think that's a difference. And another difference is, what we call routine, protocol, regularity. We're used to it. Like the university has a rhythm, and it breathes in and out, and people feel like, that's very comfortable that it does it that way. When you start a floating university, nobody knows the rhythm. Everybody goes there with some preconceptions, but they're very different. So this, offshore situation is basically also asking everybody the question, so what do I really want to repeat from my protocols that I know, or what do I kind of rather leave behind, and how do we do this together? And of course that's not, that's common in other forms, that you as a group go somewhere where you've never been and you have to sort of rebuild your ways of doing. But I don't know, maybe as universities we can also do that, sort of drop ourselves into different conditions. Or let's say pass on, kind of critically rethink who has the right to speak and to make a program, or to sort of also open parts of the program as this lecture series in a similar way, to say like, or as we do it with the Do What You Want, to say like now the student makes the program and we're in a coaching role, like just, yeah. But that's, yeah, probably also already there, nothing new.
Well, when you're working in your office, you are working in a multidisciplinary teams, not only the team at the office, because you are working with external people, even with the citizens as a specialist on the places. So that means that you need to lead or to design, as you mentioned in your way to explain your project, this type of the designing of the process. So that means not only designing the architecture itself, is also designing the whole process. How do you do what you want in the same thing that you are mentioned to the students, to lead in a certain way this type of path, when you have another types of agents that are with another pull and push pressures in your project, but you are trying to organize something in the same way that you are producing this type of organization of the university, open spaces, etc. Because for me it's something difficult. It's something that you need to maintain certain kind of balance between the things that you need to control, but in an open way. So to control in an open way is something that is a contradictory thing, but I think maybe it could be necessary in your work as a profession, no? Because this is the side that we didn't see today, no? This. How we do it. Not exactly the side, but we see more the university part that is, of course, really difficult to separate, to split to the professional part.
What we saw is like mostly Raumlabor projects that have an educational aspect or agenda, and I thought that would be interesting to share in that context. And maybe as a further response to your question, I think also what is different is the way we encounter people, I guess. That there is a lot, I think there's a difference in, as I said, with the hierarchy, there is already a difference. There is this idea, if you really sort of spend time together intensively. And I think responding to your question, from a conversation with an anthropologist around Navarino Park in Athens, I picked up this idea of taking care of a dynamic of a place. And this is, if you want to describe what we design or what we take care of, then that's already two terms that are interesting. Maybe it's not so much designing and hoping something's going to happen outside myself, but understanding the involvedness. So taking care of is more design and doing it at the same time. And taking care of the dynamics of the place shifts the focus away from making a nice public space design to investing into the social activities around that. And if sort of this dynamics is okay, that was her statement, if the dynamics is okay, the place will be looking amazing, because people will be happy and they will want the place to be happy, and the place is then an expression of this dynamics. So I think in examples like Floating University and so on, we try to work on this dynamics, that, and then we can also incorporate the making a breakfast together and the washing up together, as well as having a theoretical input. Because you need both to have a good time.
Last question. Okay.
First of all, thank you for being so honest in the way that you explain everything. It's great. And my question is about how do you engage with technology, especially in the workshops that you saw us the beginning. Let's say that in the first stage when you pick all the information and collect all the information, going there, taking notes, making drawings, and I assume that is part of this. And then do you do an extra work with, I don't know, taking data in a different way? You know what I mean? Do you combine these two things, or?
Yeah, if I can continue being honest, I think Raumlabor is not very techy. Like we're still, nobody knows data. We're using email and we're happy when it works. Yeah. So I think there's sort of a blind spot, I guess, to be engaging further. You know, like we really use technology as a communication media, and that's it. But I think it would be interesting, especially as more and more information becomes available in other forms, to somehow incorporate that in the practice more. But we're really like, as we do it so far, we're on the other side. We're more like hands-on, and let's rather cook a dinner together and talk about stuff than creating a big data environment to try and understand what the neighborhood is like.
You look happy, so I think it works. Thank you.
I think everything.